March 23, 1945. Dawn has not yet broken over the eastern shore of Okinawa. A heavy mist clings to the palm-fringed coastline. Salt and wet earth mingle in the humid air. The low tide leaves dark mud flats exposed, glistening under the first hints of light. Inside a makeshift field hospital, Japanese nurses move quietly among canvas tents. The scent of antiseptic is faint, overpowered by the humid tang of sweat and blood. Stretchers line the floor. Bandages are stacked neatly, though some are already soaked from the night's casualties. The nurses exchange muted words. Outside, crickets and insects fill the silence, unaware of the coming violence. A distant rumble reaches the shore. Ships, engines idle, yet the vibration carries through the sand and into the feet of men standing guard. Observers squint toward the horizon. Gray shapes hover just beyond visibility, unremarkable at first glance. No one knows the scale of what is approaching. The nurses think the worst is behind them. Japanese officers whisper of reinforcements that never arrived. Supply lines are thin. Confidence is thinner. History waits here in this fragile balance between the perception of victory and the reality of defeat, between the measured steps of the living and the silence of what is about to die. The first shadows of American ships break through the fog. The tide of war is about to touch the shore, and nothing will be the same again. WWII early 1945. The Pacific War had reached a point of exhaustion and escalation. The United States had seized Iwo Jima in February, its black volcanic sands still smoking with the detritus of battle. Every captured foothold brought American forces closer to the Japanese home islands, compressing time and space for the defenders. Okinawa, less than 400 miles from Kyushu, had become a strategic linchpin. Its airfields could host B-29 bombers within striking distance of Japan. Its ports would facilitate the invasion of the mainland. The Japanese high command clung to an increasingly fragile sense of control. Propaganda insisted the empire was unbroken. Newsreels portrayed American forces as faltering, unable to sustain long campaigns across the vast Pacific. Field hospitals, including those along Okinawa's eastern coast, operated under this assumption. Nurses believed reinforcements would arrive. They assumed the front lines could hold. The reality, however, was far different. Fuel shortages slowed transport. Communications were intermittent. Artillery pieces were scattered or inoperable. Officers relied on intuition as much as intelligence reports, sometimes misreading reconnaissance entirely. American naval logistics had evolved into a precision instrument by this stage. Task forces included dozens of destroyers, cruisers, landing ships, and supply vessels. Convoys were timed to the minute, rehearsed under strict radio silence. Every landing craft, every gun turret, every engine contributed to a clockwork advance. Air cover coordinated with naval bombardments, while amphibious units trained relentlessly in conditions designed to mirror Okinawa's beaches. They moved like a river, patient, inevitable. Japanese defensive doctrine, by contrast, prioritized static positions, concealed artillery, and reliance on natural terrain. Soldiers were instructed to fight to the last man. Commanders underestimated the scale of American support. Where Japanese forces had once planned for coastal defenses only, the Allies now arrived with overwhelming firepower and mobility. Reconnaissance reports were incomplete. Radar stations, where they existed, were limited in range. Intelligence failures compounded uncertainty. The nurses stationed in these field hospitals were isolated from the operational calculations of generals and admirals. They measured time in the rhythm of wounded soldiers, in the rotation of stretchers, the ebb of supplies. Their world was intimate, human, urgent, but insulated. Every shift ended with exhaustion, yet no one could feel the advance of the enemy with the clarity of those plotting it at sea. The horizon could hold anything, a fishing boat, a supply run, or a force larger than anything the island had yet seen. By March 1945, the Pacific War had become a war of numbers and endurance. Japanese forces on Okinawa numbered approximately 77,000 soldiers, reinforced by 30,000 conscripted civilians, armed in part with antiquated rifles and light artillery. American forces preparing to assault the island outnumbered them nearly 2-1, with naval gunfire support, carrier-based aircraft, and tanks ready to exploit every breach. In this context, even minor intelligence miscalculations could have catastrophic consequences. The field hospitals were not just places of healing. They were archives of human resilience and failure. Nurses recorded each casualty, each amputation, each death. They administered care under the illusion that their labor could outpace the advance of war. Outside, artillery positions were being reinforced. Troops marched through mangrove and scrub. At sea, ships adjusted their bearings, unseen in the pre-dawn haze. In the hours before dawn, everything hung in fragile equilibrium. On one side, Japanese nurses trusted that the Empire's control over the island remained intact. On the other, the American war machine approached with the precision of an unstoppable tide. Mist curled over the beaches, clinging to the mud and the seagrass. The horizon, gray and indistinct, bore the weight of decisions made thousands of miles away, in command rooms and war councils, decisions that would shatter this calm. History was poised. The contrast between expectation and reality could not have been more complete. Those who believed the war was one were about to learn, in the span of hours, how precarious their confidence had been. The geography of Okinawa itself shaped the stakes. Jagged cliffs, dense sugarcane fields, and mangrove-fringed inlets created natural obstacles for any approaching force. Roads were few and narrow, vulnerable to ambush. Rivers cut across the island, shallow in some places, impassable in others. Every hill could conceal a machine gun, every grove a hidden sniper. The Japanese defenders had studied these features, believing that intimate knowledge of terrain could compensate for shortages in manpower and firepower. Yet the Americans had adapted. The lessons of Tarawa, Saipan, and Iwo Jima informed every decision. Landing craft could navigate reefs. Amphibious tanks flattened obstructions, and naval gunfire could suppress concealed positions before troops even touched sand. Engineers and pioneers prepared to breach obstacles and construct makeshift roads, turning the island's defenses into temporary inconveniences. Air reconnaissance tracked hidden positions, photographing every ridge and gully, every bunker and pillbox. In combination, these measures meant that even the most formidable terrain could not delay the tide. Japanese intelligence had failed to perceive the full scale of these preparations. Spy networks were fragmented. Radio intercepts, where available, were incomplete or misinterpreted. Officers relied on reports that underestimated convoy strength, misjudged the timing of American arrivals, or assumed that dense fog or early morning darkness would delay attacks. Even within command posts, coordination was uneven. Field hospitals were positioned according to older assessments of likely landing sites, not the updated intelligence that the Americans carried with them. Nurses, accustomed to a life measured by shifts and casualties, were largely insulated from this strategic calculus. They understood the front abstractly, by the number of wounded who arrived, by the scarcity of supplies, but they could not anticipate the scale of what was approaching. Some whispered among themselves that the Americans might attempt a diversion. Some thought they might wait another week. Others simply clung to hope. Hope was a fragile barrier against the reality waiting offshore. Weather played its part as well. The mornings were humid, mist rising from the shore, blending with the scent of salt and decay. The mist delayed visibility, masking distant movements, lending Japanese observers a false sense of security. Yet it also complicated navigation for the approaching convoys, forcing American crews to rely on charts, compasses, and practice timing. Every decision at sea and on land was a balance between caution and momentum. By dawn, the situation was a tense equilibrium. American planners had synchronized naval bombardment, landing craft deployment, and aerial cover to within minutes. Japanese defenders relied on static artillery, scattered infantry, and the protective illusion of fog and terrain. Medical personnel, civilians, and soldiers alike shared the same space under drastically different assumptions. Every heart, every eye, every decision hung in balance. This was not a simple mismatch of forces. It was a collision of perception and reality. Japanese nurses believed that the empire still held Okinawa, that the island's defenses could withstand any incursion. American officers knew the landing force's power, its timing, and the precision with which it would strike. Between the misted shoreline and the prepared beaches lay a space measured not in meters, but in anticipation, the distance between expectation and the inexorable approach of the enemy. The calm before the storm was absolute. Tents flapped lightly in the breeze, soldiers shifted silently in the mangrove shadows, and nurses prepared another day of care. On the horizon, gray shapes moved with deceptive patience. Engines hummed faintly through the mist. Every calculation, every deployment, every choice made thousands of miles away would converge here, at this hour, on this shoreline. History waited in the mist. And soon, the assumptions of those who believed the war was won would be shattered. Human cost is almost equal to 260 words. For the nurses stationed on Okinawa's eastern coast, war had already been an unrelenting rhythm of urgency and exhaustion. Stretchers arrived before dawn, carrying soldiers with shattered limbs, gunshot wounds, and burns. Each casualty demanded attention. Bandages, morphine, surgery under canvas tents with minimal sterilization. The nurses moved with quiet efficiency, their hands steady, their faces composed, though their minds carried the constant calculation of resources and survival. They had witnessed the ebb and flow of death for months. Wounded men whispered in fading voices. Families of conscripts waited silently for news, and the constant tide of casualties blurred one day into the next. For the nurses, war was not a distant battle of generals and fleets. It was the intimate horror of human suffering measured by breath, pulse, and pallor. Yet on this morning, as dawn approached, there was a deceptive calm. No alarm sounded, no distant gunfire. Only the faint vibration of engines through sand and surf hinted that history was about to intrude on their routines. The human cost they were trained to manage would soon expand exponentially. The first American landing craft would make their presence known, and the stretchers they prepared would carry far more than the routine casualties they had anticipated. By the time the initial bombardment fell, nurses would confront what no training could fully prepare them for. The collision of expectation and reality, the sudden surge of casualties that outpaced their capacity, and the psychological weight of knowing that this night's illusion of safety was gone forever. 2. Tactical reality is almost equal to 260 words. From the perspective of military strategy, the American convoy was the culmination of precise planning. Task Force 53, under Rear Admiral John L. Hall, had coordinated landing craft, destroyers, and supply vessels to reach the shore at first light. Air reconnaissance had mapped every reef, every tidal variation, and every concealed enemy position along the approach. Every gun turret, every landing ramp, every boat engine was synchronized to the second. Japanese defenses, by contrast, relied on static observation posts, concealed artillery, and natural terrain. Hills concealed machine guns and mortars, rivers slowed troop movements, and mangrove thickets offered limited cover for infantry. But these advantages were tactical, not strategic. The Americans' ability to suppress and bypass defensive positions rendered much of this preparation vulnerable. At sea, the convoy moved in disciplined formations. Destroyers flanked landing craft to provide protective fire. Amphibious tanks were ready to breach obstacles as soon as troops disembarked. Even small errors in timing could lead to chaos on the beach, yet American coordination minimized these risks. Each vessel's speed, each approach angle, each scheduled bombardment contributed to a calculus that Japanese defenders had little ability to counter. Tactical reality was already tilting in favor of the approaching force. On the shore, defenders waited for the expected point of attack, unaware that the main effort might strike elsewhere. Their misaligned assumptions, compounded by incomplete intelligence, meant that the first American landing would not simply encounter resistance. It would overwhelm it with precision and mobility, transforming the coastline into a theater where expectation and reality collided violently. 3. Technological limitations is almost equal to 250-260 words. Technology defined the boundaries of perception on both sides. The Americans relied on radar, sonar, and aerial reconnaissance to mitigate the uncertainty of the early morning approach. Radar allowed ships to detect small movements in the mist, guiding landing craft through channels that might have otherwise grounded them. Aircraft could mark artillery positions and relay coordinates with unprecedented speed. Even communications, restricted to secure channels, allowed distant commanders to synchronize the entire operation with near-perfect precision. The Japanese, conversely, faced significant limitations. Coastal radar, where it existed, had short range and was often improperly calibrated. Field communications were intermittent, radios prone to interference, and reporting lines fragmented. Artillery observers relied on visual confirmation through foliage and fog, which made it difficult to track an approaching fleet with any certainty. The inability to see or anticipate the convoy's precise composition left commanders relying on outdated assumptions and incomplete reconnaissance. Medical technology, too, played a role in human outcomes. Field hospitals could stabilize some casualties but lacked sufficient surgical equipment for mass casualty events. Limited blood supplies, scarce anesthesia, and inadequate evacuation options compounded the vulnerability of those on the shore. Nurses were forced to improvise within the constraints of what technology allowed, even as the approaching force threatened to render those limitations tragically consequential. In this intersection of technological capability and efficiency, the balance of power on Okinawa was already subtly shifting. Every mechanical advantage favored the Americans, while every deficiency constrained the Japanese defenders. The impending collision was as much a product of engineering and planning as it was of human courage, a stark, unavoidable reality that would define the coming hours. Leadership decisions is almost equal to 250-260 words. Japanese commanders on Okinawa faced impossible choices under severe constraints. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, responsible for the southern defenses, understood the strategic importance of the island, but lacked the resources to fortify every potential landing site. Orders emphasized holding key positions to the last man, yet supplies were insufficient and communication lines were inconsistent. Decisions often relied on judgment rather than intelligence, and judgment was increasingly strained by conflicting reports and uncertainty. Field commanders attempted to coordinate artillery, infantry, and reserve units, but the American approach rendered much of this planning obsolete. Preconceived notions about likely landing points guided deployments that would soon be bypassed. Decisions to concentrate troops inland, for example, left coastal field hospitals exposed, vulnerable to both bombardment and rapid infantry advance. On the American side, leadership decisions reflected meticulous coordination. Rear Admiral Hall, Major General Roy Geiger, and their subordinates synchronized naval fire, air cover, and amphibious landings down to precise minutes. Contingency plans accounted for reefs, tides, and the dispersal of Japanese forces. Each decision, from ship positioning to landing craft sequence, was reinforced with rehearsals, drills, and redundancy. Leadership here was about certainty within chaos, contrasting sharply with the improvisation forced upon the Japanese command. The gap between these two approaches, improvised defense versus calculated offense, would determine the unfolding of events on Okinawa. Every choice made before the first landing shaped the scale and speed of the confrontation that the nurses and soldiers were about to experience. 5. Enemy miscalculations is almost equal to 250-260 words. Japanese intelligence consistently underestimated the scale and sophistication of American operations. Reports suggested that any landing would be small, isolated, and easily repelled. Convoys of dozens of vessels, carrying tanks, artillery, and thousands of troops, were beyond their expectations. Observers counted the shapes on the horizon and misjudged their numbers, assuming fog and distance masked a minor detachment rather than a full assault force. The miscalculations extended beyond quantity. Japanese planners assumed American troops would proceed cautiously, delaying an assault until daylight visibility improved. They failed to anticipate the Americans' reliance on radar, pre-mapped landing zones, and synchronized naval bombardment. Where the Japanese expected hesitation, they encountered decisive, precise action. Defensive positions that had been considered secure became vulnerable to the speed and coordination of the American advance. Even the field hospitals, believed to be out of immediate danger, were misjudged in their exposure. The arrival of landing craft and supporting naval fire would place them at the heart of the unfolding battle. What had been assumed safe, clinics, tent hospitals, and supply caches, became part of the operational calculus of destruction. Every miscalculation compounded vulnerability, leaving those on shore with little margin for survival. 6. Psychological strain is almost equal to 250-260 words. The psychological weight on Japanese nurses was profound and cumulative. Months of exhaustion, fear, and uncertainty had already eroded mental reserves. Many had been stationed at the front for years, tending to soldiers, civilians, and wounded conscripts with minimal rest. Each night brought the same questions. Would reinforcements arrive? Could the wounded be stabilized? Could the enemy be kept at bay? This strain intensified on the morning before the American convoy arrived. The deceptive calm, a quiet pre-dawn, the absence of alarm, masked the approaching chaos. Nurses moved automatically, performing routine checks and administering care, unaware that their assumptions about safety were flawed. Cognitive dissonance was acute. The body continued the habitual rhythm of care, but instinct could not sense the scale of the approaching threat. American soldiers, in contrast, faced their own mental challenges. They approached the shore knowing the potential for fierce resistance, yet confidence in planning, technology, and firepower tempered fear. For Japanese medical staff, however, the psychological burden was compounded by helplessness. They had no weapons, limited mobility, and were positioned precisely where the battle was about to break. The strain was both immediate and anticipatory. Nurses felt the weight of responsibility for human life under circumstances they could neither predict nor control. The calm of the morning, paradoxically, magnified the impact of the first shock. When the first shells fell and the convoy's engines roared into range, the psychological strain would crystallize into acute terror, fatigue, and despair, a human dimension of war that technology and tactics could not mitigate. March 23, 1945, 5:48 a.m. The first light barely touched the horizon. Mist hung over the eastern shore of Okinawa, gray and viscous, as if the island itself were holding its breath. From the sea, shapes emerged. LSTs, destroyers, and small landing craft cutting silently through the water. Engines hummed, disciplined and synchronized. The American convoy had arrived on schedule. Every movement rehearsed, every minute accounted for. On shore, Japanese nurses continued their early rounds. Stretchers were arranged, bandages replenished, morphine vials counted. They had heard distant rumbles, but assumed it was routine artillery or distant maneuvers. Officers whispered reassurances. Nothing will reach here before dawn. Yet the rumble intensified. A low vibration ran through sand and tents, reaching the soles of boots and the bare feet of exhausted medics. Then came a first shadow. A destroyer's bow sliced through the mist, its silhouette barely visible, yet unmistakable. Observers on the shore misjudged its scale, thinking it a small patrol vessel. The Japanese had prepared for minor harassment, not the coordinated force now approaching. At 6:02, The American naval guns fired. The first salvo fell short of the beaches, shaking tents and scattering equipment. Sand rained down, mingling with dust and smoke. The nurses froze, hands instinctively clutching bandages and instruments. Soldiers guarding the hospital scrambled for cover. The artillery was accurate, disciplined, and sudden, an immediate shock to all assumptions. Landing craft began to touch the shallows at 6:15. Troops disembarked with amphibious tanks rolling behind them. The combination of speed and suppression overwhelmed the Japanese forward positions. Machine gun nests fired sporadically, but gaps in coordination left the defenders exposed. Inside the field hospitals, chaos began to unfold. Wounded soldiers already stabilized were hastily moved as nurses attempted to clear pathways. Some stretchers were abandoned as the reality of the assault hit the compound. Shrapnel, incoming fire, and the sound of engines growing nearer. The mist, once a protective veil, became a medium for confusion, masking approaching enemy movements. Japanese artillery attempted to respond, but communication failures delayed targeting. Observers relayed inaccurate coordinates, and shells fell wide. Panic began to ripple through defensive positions, exposing further vulnerabilities. Every miscalculation, the underestimated convoy, the overconfidence in terrain, the reliance on static positions, converged in real time. By 6:30, American units had established small footholds on the beaches. Engineers began clearing obstacles as infantry pushed inland. The first Japanese defensive lines crumbled under a combination of naval fire, armor, and superior coordination. Medical personnel, previously insulated from combat, now faced immediate threats. Collapsing structures, incoming fire, and the challenge of treating casualties while under assault. The human toll was immediate. Nurses worked frantically, treating not just the wounded, but also those struck by fear and confusion. Soldiers shouted for assistance, wounded comrades screamed, and civilians caught in the vicinity were pulled into the maelstrom. The rhythm of the field hospital, calm, methodical, rehearsed, was replaced by improvisation born of necessity rather than planning. At 6:45, the first American tanks moved beyond the surf, crushing obstructions and targeting Japanese emplacements with precision. Defensive machine guns were silenced. Roads once considered secure became corridors of fire and death. The island's eastern shore, once seemingly calm, transformed into a tableau of relentless assault. By 7 o'clock, it was clear to all present that the battle had begun in earnest. The nurses' assumptions of safety had dissolved. The Japanese defenders' belief that reinforcements would stabilize the situation evaporated. History, previously distant and abstract, now pressed down on every individual, shaping outcomes with immediate, unforgiving consequence. The tide of war, measured in engines, boots, and gunfire, had broken onto the shore. And the hours that followed would determine not only the survival of the defenders, but the fate of Okinawa itself. By 7:10 a.m., the American foothold on the eastern shore of Okinawa had expanded. Landing craft continued to arrive in disciplined waves. Infantry poured onto the beaches, supported by amphibious tanks and flamethrower units trained to neutralize bunkers and pillboxes. Naval gunfire pounded inland positions, each shell obliterating walls, fences, and concealed fortifications. The combined effect was overwhelming. The static Japanese defenses, carefully arranged over months, were being dismantled in minutes. Japanese soldiers fought with determination, but confusion reigned. Orders were delayed or misinterpreted. Machine gun nests fired sporadically. Artillery units aimed at vague silhouettes through mist and smoke. Every misaligned action amplified the destructive power of the American assault. Communication breakdowns ensured that reinforcements could not be coordinated. Officers ran between positions, shouting commands that were often drowned by the roar of engines, the crack of rifles, and the thunder of naval artillery. Within the field hospitals, the impact was immediate and brutal. Nurses abandoned some tents as incoming shells struck, near supply caches. Stretchers were knocked over, bandages scattered into the mud. Wounded soldiers screamed. Medics attempted triage, but the flow of casualties accelerated beyond manageable levels. For those inside, the battle was no longer distant. It was inside every canvas flap, every corridor of sandbags, and every shadow cast by collapsing structures. By 7:30, the first Japanese defensive lines inland had begun to collapse. Infantry units attempted counterattacks, but were cut down by tanks and concentrated fire. Roads, once assumed secure, became kill zones. Mangrove thickets, previously a natural defense, now trapped retreating soldiers and civilians alike. The Americans advanced methodically, exploiting every breach and gap. Each step forward consolidated gains, further undermining morale and coordination among Japanese troops. Key commanders, including Lieutenant General Ushijima, realized the magnitude of the assault too late. Communications with subordinate units were sporadic. Orders to regroup and counterattack failed to reach the front lines. The Americans' ability to maintain initiative rendered Japanese planning irrelevant. By 8 o'clock, the eastern sector of Okinawa was effectively under American control, though pockets of resistance remained. Casualty numbers escalated rapidly. Field hospitals overflowed. Nurses, already exhausted from night-long shifts, now faced unprecedented demand. They administered care under fire, improvising with limited resources. Injuries ranged from blast trauma and shrapnel wounds to burns and fractures inflicted by collapsing structures and enemy fire. Civilians caught in the crossfire suffered alongside soldiers. The human toll was immediate, tangible, and horrifying. Psychologically, the impact on the Japanese defenders and medical personnel was profound. The illusion of security, an expectation that the empire's control remained intact, shattered in the space of 30 minutes. Panic, despair, and confusion spread among units. Soldiers who had been prepared to hold positions to the last man now abandoned them in disarray. Nurses and medics confronted the impossible task of preserving life amidst advancing firepower. The scale of destruction, combined with the speed of the American advance, rendered every prior assumption invalid. By 8:15, the Americans had established a continuous line along the eastern coastline. The beachhead, once a narrow strip of sand, now stretched inland, connecting each landing sector. Reinforcements continued to arrive in waves, expanding the zone of control. Japanese units attempting to regroup were intercepted and neutralized. The battle had shifted irreversibly. What remained of the defenders' strategy was now reactive, improvisational, and doomed. The first American tanks moved deeper into previously defended territory, flattening obstacles and neutralizing hidden emplacements. Machine guns and mortars were silenced, either destroyed or abandoned. The defenders' cohesion dissolved, replaced by a series of desperate, isolated engagements. Every movement, every firefight, every scream from the field hospitals reflected the convergence of planning, technology, and sheer force. The morning had transformed the shore into a theater of irreversible change. By 8:30, the eastern sector of Okinawa was firmly under American control, the initial objective of the convoy accomplished. Japanese commanders faced a grim reality. Their defensive line was fractured, their reinforcements delayed or destroyed, and the flow of casualties overwhelming medical facilities. For the nurses, the war's illusion of safety had ended. For the soldiers, the balance of power on the island had shifted decisively. And for history, this moment would mark the point at which Okinawa's fate and the calculus of the Pacific War tilted irreversibly toward the Allies. By mid-morning on March 23, 1945, the eastern shoreline of Okinawa bore the immediate scars of battle. Canvas tents had been shredded by naval shells, medical supplies scattered in mud and sand. Field hospitals were partially destroyed, forcing nurses to improvise treatment spaces in ditches and under partially collapsed awnings. The first wave of American landings had overwhelmed Japanese defensive positions, leaving many soldiers dead or incapacitated on the beaches. Casualty numbers mounted rapidly. Japanese forces sustained severe losses in both personnel and material. Within the first 3 hours of engagement, estimates suggest that hundreds of infantrymen were killed, while artillery units were silenced or abandoned. The rapid collapse of defensive lines created pockets where retreating soldiers were cut off, captured, or destroyed. Civilians caught near forward positions added to the toll, as mangrove thickets and narrow coastal roads became deadly traps. For American forces, casualties were lower but significant. Mines, concealed machine guns, and sporadic artillery fire inflicted injuries on infantry and engineers. Landing craft sustained minor damage, though the rigorous planning and coordination minimized the risk of catastrophic losses. Tanks advancing inland faced sporadic resistance, but were largely able to exploit gaps in Japanese defenses. The combination of overwhelming firepower and tactical precision ensured that the beachhead was secure within hours. The field hospitals, meanwhile, faced a dual crisis, treating incoming casualties while coping with the destruction of their facilities. Nurses worked under fire, relocating patients, and improvising triage with what supplies remained. Stretchers were stacked in shallow ditches, bandages torn from shattered tents. The human cost was immediate, intense, and unrelenting. Fatigue compounded psychological strain as nurses and medics struggled to preserve life under conditions for which no preparation could fully suffice. Infrastructure along the eastern shore was devastated. Roads were cratered by naval bombardments, bridges collapsed under artillery fire, and small defensive bunkers were obliterated. Supply depots, previously assumed secure, were destroyed or looted during the initial assault. Communications lines severed, both for local commanders and rear echelon units, further fractured the Japanese capacity to respond effectively. Strategically, the immediate consequences were clear. American forces now controlled a crucial coastal corridor, providing a secure landing zone for subsequent reinforcements, artillery, and supplies. Japanese defensive capability had been fractured, with inland positions isolated and coordination disrupted. The psychological impact on Japanese troops and civilians was profound. The illusion of control was shattered, and the speed of the American advance underscored the vulnerability of even well-prepared positions. Within the first hours of the landing, the battlefield had transformed. What had been a morning of routine care for nurses, a measured defense for Japanese soldiers, and a calculated assault for Americans had become a landscape of chaos, death, and irreversible change. The eastern sector of Okinawa was no longer merely a contested coastline. It had become a testament to the power of coordination, firepower, and human endurance under fire. By midday, the eastern coastline of Okinawa had been irrevocably altered. Japanese defensive lines were shattered, and the American foothold enabled the rapid arrival of reinforcements. Tanks, artillery, and infantry poured inland, exploiting the fractured resistance. The loss of territory forced Japanese commanders to abandon prearranged fallback positions and improvisationally consolidate remaining units in pockets further from the coast. Strategically, the consequences were immediate and profound. The Americans now controlled a critical entry point for the island, enabling successive waves of troops to secure supply lines and establish artillery positions capable of supporting inland operations. Japanese commanders, including Lieutenant General Ushijima, recognized the urgency of redeploying forces to delay the inevitable advance. Yet logistical limitations, damaged roads, destroyed bridges, and severed communications made coordination nearly impossible. The psychological impact on Japanese defenders and civilians was equally devastating. Field hospitals, once havens of relative calm, became zones of chaos. Nurses documented the breakdown of routines, noting patients exposed to artillery fire and advancing infantry. Many staff members reported shock, exhaustion, and disbelief at the speed of the assault. Some wrote later accounts describing the moment when the first American tanks breached inland positions, a sudden, visceral understanding that the war, long thought contained, had arrived at their doorstep. Survivor testimonies confirmed the immediacy of the human toll. One nurse recalled later, "The shells fell before anyone could react. We moved the stretchers into ditches, but the wounded cried in ways I had never heard. It was not just fear, it was the world itself collapsing around us." Soldiers trapped between collapsing defensive lines and advancing convoys described disorientation and despair, while officers struggled to relay orders over lines damaged by bombardment. American reports documented the efficiency of the landing. Task Force 53 established a continuous beachhead within 3 hours, capturing artillery positions and neutralizing bunkers with minimal disruption to their momentum. Estimates suggest that over 1,200 Japanese soldiers were killed or incapacitated during the initial assault on the eastern sector, while the Americans sustained fewer than 150 casualties. Civilian deaths, though harder to quantify, added further tragedy to the operational picture. By late morning, the battlefield had shifted decisively. Remaining Japanese units were forced to retreat inland or risk annihilation. Nurses and medics continued to work under fire, improvising triage stations as American units advanced. The initial assumptions of victory held by many staff members were replaced by the stark reality of occupation and the immediate demands of survival. The broader implications extended beyond the tactical moment. Control of the eastern shore allowed the Allies to project force deeper into Okinawa, hastening the collapse of organized Japanese resistance across the island. Field hospitals had to adapt to a sustained influx of casualties over days, testing the limits of human endurance and medical improvisation. Documented accounts highlight the exhaustion, courage, and improvisation of nurses who, in the span of a single morning, witnessed the destruction of both their assumptions and the environment around them. By noon, the first phase of the battle was complete. The Americans held their landing zones. Japanese defenses were fractured and disorganized. The human and strategic costs were already etched into the sand, mud, and shattered tents of the eastern shoreline. In hours, the balance of power on Okinawa had irrevocably shifted. The collision between meticulous planning and assumption, between preparation and improvisation, had produced a landscape of irreversible consequence. The shore of Okinawa, once misted and silent, would never appear the same to those who survived that morning. Canvas tents lay torn, roads cratered, and mangrove thickets scarred by fire and tracks of advancing tanks. Yet beyond the physical destruction, the enduring impact was human. The nurses who had measured time by breaths and bandages now measured it by survival. The soldiers who had prepared to hold lines found their world reshaped in hours. In this moment, the war revealed a simple, relentless truth. Planning, coordination, and technology could override assumptions, no matter how deeply held. The Americans' precise timing, synchronized naval and aerial firepower, and methodical landings transformed expectation into reality with unerring efficiency. The Japanese defenders had relied on terrain, static positions, and morale bolstered by belief in reinforcements. Tools insufficient against a force that combined mobility, firepower, and intelligence into an unstoppable tide. The nurse's perspective, intimately tied to the preservation of life, highlights a dimension often absent in military histories: the quiet endurance of those who witness destruction without wielding it. Their courage and adaptability under fire are as much a testament to human resilience as the strategies that shaped the landing itself. In the span of a few hours, the illusion of control, the confidence in preparedness, and the calm of routine were replaced by immediacy, improvisation, and the stark presence of mortality. Strategically, the morning marked the consolidation of Allied control over a critical portion of Okinawa, accelerating the collapse of organized Japanese resistance on the island. Yet in the quiet aftermath, in the trenches, ditches, and improvised triage stations, the true story of that dawn unfolded in human terms: endurance, fear, improvisation, and loss. The events of March 23, 1945, demonstrate that war is not only the clash of armies. but the collision of perception with reality. Plans, doctrine, and assumptions give way to the immediacy of action. The shoreline, once calm and expectant, became the point where history turned decisively, not with spectacle, but with precision, consequence, and the quiet persistence of those forced to endure it.